So glutes and deadlift. What is actually going on? How do I cue myself to activate my glutes, or should I even cue myself? Well, what we have to talk about first is the action of the glutes at the hip and what they're actually responsible for. So within the transverse plane, we know that the glutes are your external rotators. Within the frontal plane, we know that they're your hip abductors here, and they can control kind of position of the pelvis when you're on a single leg. We also know that in the sagittal plane that there are hip extensors, and they also are responsible for posteriorly tilting the pelvis. So kind of that tucking under phenomenon that you'll have in a hip thrust or a barbell glute bridge. So in the deadlift, a lot of coaches like to cue in the bottom, push those knees out just a little bit so we don't have that valgus collapse as you're driving the floor away. And I discussed in another video how that could actually be due to stability within the arch of the foot, and it's not any sort of dysfunction within the hip complex. But in the deadlift, what we also have to remember is that over-cueing the glutes within the sagittal plane can actually cause some of that posterior tilt within the bottom, and it can take you out of a neutral lumbar position. So when you're set up for the pull, a lot of coaches will cue, find your glutes and find your hamstrings when you're in the bottom, and put just enough tension into the floor so that you can feel those turn on. So what I mean is, you'll see some people when they're in the bottom, as soon as they go to put a little bit of tension into the bar and pull the slack out, rather than doing it by driving their whole foot into the floor, activating their quads and some of their hamstrings, they'll do it by maybe cueing the glutes and trying to find their glutes, and it'll almost roll their pelvis underneath them and take them out of neutral, just like that. So a better way to cue yourself is to think of the deadlift as not a pull and not a push, but a combination of the two. And what I mean is that the deadlift should be thought about as occurring in a straight line, the bar path specifically. Now, obviously, if you have longer legs, longer femurs, here to here, then in order to get yourself down to the bar and to drop your hip position, you're going to have to change your knee position forward. So in my case, my last move, once I take my breath, is I will retension myself with my hamstrings here, find some tension through my quads as I'm putting force through the floor. And I don't worry about my glutes so much because they're hip extensors. So then as I'm coming into hip extension, that's when you're going to get higher levels of glute activation. That's why a lot of people struggle to get their hips fully extended on glute bridges, hip thrusts, all of these variations, because they just struggle with glute activation or glute weakness. So in the deadlift, we have to kind of think about it as, going back to our push and pull, as a push into the floor while simultaneously pulling the bar into our body. So it's not about actively pulling back or doing any one of these numbers, but if you can cue yourself to get simultaneous contraction of the quads and then drop your hips by using the hamstrings, now we have co-contraction here while keeping ourselves in neutral, and then as we go to push off the floor, we're much more stable. So it's kind of a different way to mentally approach the lift and cue yourself in order to drop your hips down to the bottom. So some people start too low in the bottom, or they cue their glutes and try and rotate the pelvis underneath them. So try it out. Think about it as more pushing into the floor, pulling the bar into your body, and using your quads and your hamstrings rather than just your glutes. So give it a shot. Drop a comment below if you tried it out, and let me know what you think.